I've worked at a graveyard for the past 15 years. Most of those years being the typical graveyard shift, which was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. In my mind, working overnight had way more benefits than working during the day. Day workers had more to do since more people would be visiting the yard. There would also be burials taking place a few times a week that need to be arranged. And, above everything else, night shift gets paid an extra $2 an hour. I've seen a lot during my years working night shift though. Mostly teens messing around or the occasional drunk group of friends daring each other to walk through the yard. However, this night was different. I got to the small faculty building a bit early to chat with the day worker, and once he left, I did all of the normal checks and precautions at the beginning of my shift. Afterwards, my only job is really just to drive around in a golf cart every so often and just make sure nothing's going on. I'd say I only encounter something once a month, or maybe even every other month. Anyway, the first few hours were normal. I drove around several times, then went back to the small faculty building to eat my lunch. I think it was around 2 a.m. when I went back out to do another round of the yard. As I got to the far end, I saw something by the fence. It was obviously really dark, so I couldn't see much more than the general shape of a figure standing there. I drove up closer. I could tell now that it was a man standing on the outside of the fence, looking toward me. I didn't want to confront him if I didn't have to, so I turned and drove in a small loop around the lot to see if he would try to hop the fence while I was gone. But when I got back after 30 seconds, he was gone. I scanned the area briefly to make sure he didn't sneak in, but it all looked clear, so I continued with my patrol. Going through the whole yard takes about 15 minutes, but sometimes I'd go slower just to pass the time. I went all the way around and decided to check back on the spot where I saw the man. I really didn't have anything better to do anyways. I started driving down there, and almost immediately, I spotted the man again. He was inside the yard, standing on the gravel path. I drove up closer again, but the man didn't move. I exited the golf cart and started walking up to him. He looked like a 40-year-old man. I stopped just a few feet away from him. "Sir, you can't be in here. I need to escort you out," I said, but he didn't even turn his head to look at me. After a second, a slight rush of fear went through me. "Sir, I need you to come with me." I reached out my hand gently to tap his shoulder. As soon as I did, he whipped his head around to look at me. He just stared into my eyes. He looked full of rage. I took my hand away, and the man turned around and started walking away. I got back in my golf cart, preparing to call the police, as I watched him go all the way down to the fence. He stepped over it and continued walking away. I was relieved, but still terrified. I drove straight back to the faculty building and went inside. It was a small, single-room, security-type building, but I felt a lot safer and calmer inside. I sat down and caught my breath. In all my years, I'd never really been scared because it was always just people messing around, but this was different. I waited inside for a while, I'm not sure how long, until I heard a bang on the door. I jumped out of my chair and stared at the door in fear. A few seconds later, they banged on the door again. These were aggressive knocks, not those of someone friendly. I had nowhere to go. I picked up the desk phone and called 911. I didn't know what they wanted or why they were here, but I wasn't going to risk it all to find out. After probably 3 minutes of them banging on the door, I heard them walk away. I still waited for the police to arrive before I opened the door. The following day, my manager was able to pull the CCTV security footage from the building. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered the building, the man I'd seen in the yard earlier walked up to the door. He stood there silently for nearly 15 minutes before he banged on the door. He was also holding something in his hand, but the footage wasn't detailed enough to make out the object. It was likely a small pipe or bat of some sort. The man was never identified, but I still work the same job at the graveyard and haven't seen him since. I'd been working the night shift at the gas station for almost a year at this point. It's not the best job, but it pays my cheap bills. The hours are long and the work is repetitive. I thought many times about quitting and finding work somewhere else, and this incident was my breaking point. It was a typical night at the gas station. I had just finished cleaning off the pumps and restocking the shelves when I saw the headlights of a car pulling into the lot. It was an old, beat-up car with tinted windows. As the car pulled up to the pump, I could see that there was only one person inside. He got out and started walking up to the door. It was a man, probably in his mid-30s. He had dark hair and was wearing a black leather jacket and looked like he hadn't slept in days. I greeted him with a smile and asked him if he needed any help. He didn't say anything, but just threw a 20 on the counter and went back out to fill up his tank. It was a bit rude, but that's normal when working at a gas station, especially late at night when nobody wants to talk. I watched out the window as he filled up his tank, but a couple minutes passed and he was still there with the pump in his car. I knew he only put $20 in, so he had to have finished a while ago. I waited another couple minutes, then I opened the door and started to say something, asking if he needed any help, but he just got back in his car and drove away. I blew it off and went back inside the store, but as the night wore on, I started to feel like something was off. I don't know how else to describe the feeling. Nobody else was pulling in to get gas, and it was really quiet outside. Then, I heard a noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded like a box falling off a shelf. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the back of the store. As I turned the corner, there was a man standing there going through our inventory. He was tall and skinny and looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. I froze in fear, not sure what to do. The man turned and saw me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. Then he started to walk towards me, his eyes fixed on mine. I backed away slowly, putting my hands up as if to not mean any harm, but he kept coming towards me. I could smell alcohol in his breath, and I knew that he was dangerous. "Money, where is it?" he said, slurring his words. I saw in one of his hands he had a switchblade, and with him being clearly drunk, I was really scared. I pointed toward the register, and he pushed me back to the counter. As I was opening the till, the man wandered around the store, making his way to the liquor section. He stashed a few expensive bottles in his backpack, then came back to the register. I put all the bills we had on the counter, being barely over $100. The man looked at it, then looked at me. "The f*** is this? I need more, man." He wasn't satisfied, but there was no more money to give. He flipped open his blade, waving it around and yelling at me. I was sure he was going to jump the counter and beat me to death, but then he suddenly swiped the cash and bolted out the door. My heart was pounding as I looked out the window, seeing that same beat-up car from earlier. The man got inside and they drove off. The police came a few minutes later, responding to the emergency button I pressed while the man was browsing the booze, but they weren't too helpful right away. Thankfully though, the cameras outside the building were able to pull a license plate from the car, and 4 days later, I was informed that both men were caught. Apparently they were homeless and had stolen the car. They then went on a crime spree, robbing as many stores as they could, mostly just of alcohol and money. I feel pretty lucky to have made it unharmed, because their erratic behavior sent one worker to the hospital after an encounter with them. A couple weeks later though, I quit my job and moved to work in the day shift somewhere else. I'm a receptionist at a local hotel, and most of my shifts are overnight. I'm in charge of the front desk, and my main responsibilities are to check in guests, answer phone calls, and keep an eye on the security cameras. It's usually a pretty quiet job, since our hotel isn't the biggest or busiest. This night, the hotel was mostly empty. There were only a few guests staying with us. I was sitting at the front desk on my phone when I saw a man start walking towards the doors outside. I stood up and greeted him when he came inside. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I need a room for the night." He was definitely high on something, but regardless, I checked him in and gave him a key to his room. It was standard to allow walk-in bookings when the hotel was less than 75% full. He started walking toward the elevators, and I sat back down and pulled my phone out. A few hours later, I was sitting at the front desk when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a thump sound, like a door trying to be forced open. I got up and walked around the corner to the end of the hallway. The man I checked in a few hours ago was standing there, trying to open up one of our maintenance doors. "Can I help you find something?" I asked. He looked over at me with those creepy eyes. I asked again, but he just stared at me. I wasn't really sure what to think. Maybe he was really high and looking for the vending machine or something. I don't know. I didn't want to anger the man though, so I went back to my desk and forgot about it. A good amount of time passed with no activity. No sounds from any of the rooms, nobody entering the building or walking through the halls. It was around 3 in the morning, and I did a small walk around the bottom floor just to keep myself awake and busy. As I got to the hallway by the front desk though, I heard a very sudden, loud banging coming from one of the rooms. I stopped and listened for a moment, then went up the stairs to the second floor, where I thought it came from. It was very quiet now, which made me somewhat nervous. I walked down the hall, hearing nothing, but when I reached the end, one of the room's doors was open. I listened again for a second, before lightly knocking. Nobody responded. I cautiously peeked inside, unsure of what to expect. It seemed empty. I wasn't comfortable walking all the way inside though, so I couldn't really look around, but I was sure nobody was inside. I closed the door and looked at the room number. 112. That was the room I'd given to the man. I never saw him exit the building though. I quickly walked back down to the front desk. I looked at all the security cameras we had in the lobby and outside the building, but the man didn't turn up. I jumped. It was the hotel phone. One of the rooms was calling. I picked it up. "Hello, how can I help you?" There was a woman on the line, telling me about some man knocking on her door in the middle of the night. I apologized and assured her I would take care of it. I hung up and took a deep breath. I was getting really nervous now. I walked around the desk, but then again, the phone started ringing. It was someone else from a different room this time, saying he had the same experience as the other woman, someone knocking at his door in the middle of the night. I called the police right away. I stood by the front doors until they arrived, just in case I needed a quick escape. Luckily they came before anything happened, but they didn't find the man. Instead, they found a broken window in his room, where he likely jumped out of. It was on the second story though, so I'm not sure how he managed to get away without some major injuries. Later, while the police were still searching, they got a report that the car he used to pay for the room was stolen. It's unclear what the man intended to do or why he was knocking on people's doors. I'm thankful none of them opened their doors though, because this case could have been much worse if they had. I worked at a small local diner for a year back in 2019. It was just a regular ordinary restaurant, and I was a server there. The place closed at 10 every night, but my shift actually ended at 11 because I had to clean all the tables in the back room before heading home. It was a normal night of closing alone, and I just locked the doors at 10 p.m. I began wiping down the tables, but after just a couple seconds, several loud knocks came from the front door. It made me jump, but I looked over and saw a man standing there, looking through the glass door. I spoke loudly, telling him the place was closed for the night. This has happened before, so it wasn't much of a big deal, but the guy stayed there for a little bit as if he didn't understand what I said. I walked closer to the door. "Sorry, the store closed at 10. We aren't taking any more orders tonight." I spoke even louder this time, so I knew he heard me. The guy looked at me for a second with no reaction, before making a slight smile and turning around as he walked away. I thought he might have been drunk or something, but I forgot about it after a couple minutes and continued with my work. I finished cleaning all the tables and started wiping down the front counter when I saw out of the corner of my eye a figure moving towards the front door, followed by knocking again. It was the same guy from 15 minutes ago, standing right outside, looking through the door at me. I'd never had someone do this before, so I was more annoyed this time. I raised both of my arms up as in a "what are you doing" kind of gesture. The man, still staring at me, knocked again. I told him with a very loud and strict voice that we were closed and he needed to leave. This time though, he looked very bothered by what I had said. He tensed up, then gave the door a small push as if to test if it was locked or not, before walking away. "What the hell is wrong with that guy?" I said out loud to myself as I walked towards the front windows to make sure that he was leaving the area. I didn't see him anywhere in the parking lot, so I figured he was gone for good. I checked the time and was slightly annoyed as it was later than I was hoping. But just as I began walking over to the counter, a sudden loud bang came from the restaurant's back door. I froze in fear as I wasn't confident whether or not the back door was locked. But a couple seconds later, they began hitting the door over and over. Knowing now that the door was locked, I knew I needed to leave while I still had the chance. I sprinted out the front door and got my car, calling the police as fast as I could. After a minute or two, I could see through the restaurant window as the man appeared and began looking through the whole building. Then he tried to open the cash register, but I think he gave up after a few tries and then he disappeared to the back of the store. Once the police arrived, they made sure the man was gone and then got the whole story from me. The back door had huge dents in it, and the door handle was almost completely gone, clearly having been beaten by a hammer or something. But other than that, there wasn't much damage, or even anything stolen aside from the tip jar that we kept at the front counter. I just find it crazy that some people are willing to do these sort of things just for a couple extra bucks. Who knows what he would have done if I had stood in his way. I spent most of my 20s working at a variety of stores as a stocker, basically just putting products on shelves all day. After a few years though, I took a job at a common pet store that required me to work at multiple locations. I'd basically get a small van full of boxes every day, and I'd drive to all the stores in the area and fill their shelves, then drop the van off at the warehouse when I finished. The thing about this job though was that I'd pick up the van at 2 p.m., and so I wouldn't get out until 12. But most nights it would take much longer, and I'd have to do 1 to 2 hours of overtime. This wasn't too big of a deal for me, because with the overtime I was making really good money, but the shift did make it hard to have a normal life. Anyways, I had been doing it for several months already, and it was just like every other shift. It was 11 p.m. and I was heading to the last store, which meant I probably wouldn't get back to the warehouse until 1 a.m. Obviously, the pet stores closed at 9, so I'd always be the only one there. There was a small dock in the back that I could pull my van next to, and then take my dolly out and roll the boxes in, so I pulled up as usual and unlocked the door to the building. I rolled in 3 large stacks of boxes and began moving each box to the aisle that the product belonged to when I heard a small thud from the front of the store. I looked up and stood there quietly for a few seconds, then went back to work after there were no more noises. I did get creeped out sometimes when working in the stores alone at night, but I'd gotten used to it at this point. When the buildings are quiet, you can hear sound you normally don't, like the air conditioning turning on and off, so I figured the noise was just another random sound that the building made. I finished unloading the boxes to the aisles and began opening them and stocking the product. I was probably halfway done, and nearly 45 minutes in, when I heard the distinct sound of a single cough echo through the building. I froze, staring at the front of the store again. I could feel my heart instantly start racing as I was absolutely terrified. Nobody was supposed to be here, and I knew that if they didn't have bad intentions, then they would have said something when I came in. After waiting for almost a minute, I slowly and quietly started stepping towards the back door. Once I made it outside, I shut the door and locked it. Feeling much safer now, I got into my van and pulled my phone out to call 911. Just as I did that, I heard footsteps rushing towards the door from the inside, followed by the door handle moving slightly. The door was key-locked, so I knew they wouldn't be able to open it, but it was still terrifying and made my adrenaline start pumping. Then, loud, harsh banging and possibly even kicking came from the other side of the door. The man started yelling, pleading with me to let him out. I could hear the anger and rage in his voice. I didn't respond and hurried to call the police. As I was on the phone, the man was swearing and cursing, repeatedly hitting the door and aggressively trying to get it open. Once the operator said the police were on their way, I turned the van on and moved further down, away from the door. I know I should have been safe and just driven far away, but part of me wanted to make sure that this guy didn't escape before the police arrived. Thankfully, they got here pretty quick. I met them at the door, which was now quiet, and gave them the key. The 3 officers went in, and a couple minutes later they came out with a man in handcuffs. He was found with a pretty big knife on him, but nothing else. I think that's the weirdest part of this whole situation, and the thing that I think about the most. The man was hiding in a store with a knife, and didn't steal anything. I'd never seen the man before, so I don't know why he'd want to harm me, but it seems like that might be the only explanation. It's scary to think that I could have been just a few feet away from something horrible, but at least now I don't have to worry about what his true intentions were. For almost 3 years, I worked overnight at a fast food restaurant as the drive-thru attendant. My college class schedule was unusual and was only part-time, so working overnight actually made my life a lot easier to get schoolwork done during the day. For the most part, my shifts would go by slow and would be very uneventful. However, sometimes strange things would happen. My manager always did his best to make sure 2 people were scheduled overnight, but every once in a while we'd have to be alone for the night. Thankfully, most of the weird things would happen with my coworker there with me, but with this one incident I wasn't so lucky. My main coworker that worked overnights with me was taking his vacation week, so that left me alone 3 out of the 5 night shifts that I worked that week. My first 2 nights went as usual with no problems. It was slow and all the drive-thru customers' orders were small and simple. On the 3rd night, it started out slow as well, with only 5 to 10 customers coming every hour, ordering a small snack or a drink. Then around 2 a.m., there was a long break of nobody showing up for almost 45 minutes. I kept my headset on in case someone pulled into the drive-thru, but decided to start cleaning while I had extra time. There wasn't really anything else to do, so cleaning was my way of passing the time. I'm not really sure how long I was cleaning for, as I was never interrupted. But I passed by the front counter at one point and noticed bright headlights shining through the front window of the store. The car was parked right outside the doors. Our restaurant's dining room closed at 9 p.m. every night, and only kept the drive-thru open, so it was a little weird that someone was parked there. But of course, I didn't really think too much of it, as they could have just parked to pull up directions on their iPhone or something, so I continued with my cleaning. A few minutes later though, my headset beeped, signaling that a customer was in the drive-thru lane. I quickly made my way to the window and asked how I could help them. A man spoke softly, asking for a large soda. I told him to pull forward, then began pouring his fountain drink as usual. The guy pulled up really quickly though, so I was still pouring the drink, but I could see in the corner of my eye that he was looking in the window at the restaurant. Some people did this, but I never understood why because it makes it really awkward, but I finished up and handed him the drink. He gave me exact change, then I thanked him, telling him to have a good night as I stepped away and went back to cleaning. I wiped down a few counters and reorganized a small shelf, but as I passed by the window, I jumped back a little, as the man was still there, staring at me. "Did you need something else, sir?" He didn't respond for a moment, not even reacting to my question, before he finally said no and drove away. The guy must have been sitting there looking in the window for a whole 5 minutes while I was cleaning, which was really creepy and weird. But I knew the doors to the restaurant were locked, so I still felt somewhat safe. Again, I kept my headset on and went over to the front counters to wipe them down. A few more minutes go by before there's a beep in the headset again, but when I got to the computer and asked what they wanted, nobody answered. I asked again, and still got no response, so I turned around and looked at the cameras behind me that showed live footage of the drive-thru line. Strangely, the car passed the ordering station and was stopped several feet behind the window I was standing at. I looked closer and could recognize the car as the man from just a few minutes ago. At this point, I was starting to get pretty nervous, so I backed away from the window and stood around the corner. The way I was positioned, I was out of sight from the window, but I could still see the footage from the camera. I couldn't tell what the guy in the car was doing, but I could see movement in the grainy video. A minute later, he pulls the car up quickly and starts banging on the window aggressively. I was startled, but after a few moments, he speeds his car out of the drive-thru lane and parks right in front of the front door. The driver door swings open and the man gets out, holding something in his hand as he quickly approaches the front door. I immediately grabbed the store phone and called 911 as the man aggressively shook the handles, trying to force the locked doors open. Thankfully, he gave up after a few tries and ran back to his car, driving away. The police made sure I was okay when they arrived, and I told them what had happened. From what I heard, they came back in the morning to speak with my manager and collect the camera footage so that they could get a license plate. I was never updated on the situation after that, though, so I'm not really sure if he was caught. I've always assumed the man was attempting a robbery, but there's no way to know for sure. Being alone that night made me an easy target though, and a lot of horrible things could have happened, and there would have been no one there to help me.
It was just past 11 p.m., and I was in the back room of our building, moving boxes around. It was just a regular hardware store, and I was an overnight stalker there. My other coworker that I usually work with was on vacation, so it was just me for the night. I didn't mind though, because people always expect less from you when you're left alone to do all the work, so if anything didn't get done, it wouldn't really matter. I was working slowly, taking my time. All of the deliveries that came in during the day needed to be put by the aisles where they belonged, so I was just breaking down the pallets and putting boxes on carts that I would then roll into the main shopping area and stock the boxes from there. Once I had filled a few carts, I grabbed one and pushed it to the aisle on the far left. It was raining, or maybe even storming, pretty heavily outside, though through the rain, I thought I heard something from the front of the building. I didn't really care, not even crossing my mind for a second that it was anything other than the building making noises. I took a few boxes and started stocking, humming to myself to save me from the boredom. But then again, I thought I heard something. I walked down to the front of the store and looked all the way at the other end where the front door was. There didn't seem to be anything or anyone. I stayed there for a little bit, again, in no rush to work, and then it happened again. I could have sworn this time that I saw something moving by the front door, and that was where the sounds seemed to come from. Being in my place of work, with all the doors locked, I wasn't really afraid of anything, but more just wanted to make sure nothing strange was going on outside. I went up to the front door and looked out the glass, which I noticed had huge smudges and scratches on them. Nothing was outside, no cars or people, just heavy rain pouring down. I turned and started walking away, back to where I was working. It was quiet for a while, maybe a whole hour even, but then the sound came again from the front door. I dropped what I was doing immediately and walked back to the front, and from across the store, I could for sure make out a figure moving around outside the door. I began walking closer before the figure stopped, stood still for a second, then ran away. I ran up to the door, trying to catch a glimpse of the person, but it was too dark and rainy. Looking at the door though, there were definitely more marks on it than there was before. I was confident that this person was trying to break in. I pulled out my phone, still standing by the door, and called the police. The operator said it wouldn't be too long, just a few minutes. I put my phone back in my pocket and waited by the door. Looking around, the parking lot was still empty, but then I turned my head to look against the building, and on the very side was that same figure. I backed away quickly, worried that he may have seen me. I took several steps back and tried to be quiet. Not even 10 seconds later, the figure appeared right outside the door. While the glass was somewhat foggy and had raindrops all over it, I could tell he was looking at me. He slammed something against the window. It looked like maybe a large rock. Then he hit it again and again, trying to break the glass. I backed away quicker and ran to the back of the store, locking myself in the office. Through the building, I heard the glass shatter and the alarm by the door go off. I waited in fear, hearing nothing else. A few minutes of silence passed, and I was growing more and more nervous, until the police finally showed up. I heard them call out, then walk around searching the place before they got to the office, where I identified myself and told them what I knew. The guy wasn't in the store, so I guess after he broke the glass, he just left. It seems really weird and doesn't make any sense. Part of me even wishes that he had actually stolen something so that I'd at least know that that was what he was after. But given he didn't do anything after breaking down the door, I don't know what he wanted, and that is what still scares me to this day. I used to be a bus driver for the local suburban kindergarten and elementary schools. After nearly 15 years, I retired from that job and started driving for the buses in the city where I lived. I loved my job driving kids around, but as I got older, it became more difficult for me to put on a smiling face every day and interact with energetic and chaotic children. Driving in the city, the bus lot was only a 10-minute walk from my apartment, and the passengers would mostly just get in and out. While the actual driving part of the job was more stressful, I still felt a sense of relief compared to before. Anyway, the city bus company I worked for had buses running 24/7, though at night they only have a few buses out, and they would just run longer routes. Few drivers actually wanted these shifts, so all of us day drivers were forced to do 2 night shifts every other week, It wasn't horrible, aside from it messing up my sleep schedule. There were less passengers and the roads were more empty, so the job was much more relaxing than it was during the day. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. this night, and nobody was out. I drove my normal route several times over the course of an hour, and not a single person needed a ride. I maybe only saw 4 or 5 people total even walking outside. I pulled up to the last stop of the route and parked. Not to pick anyone up, but just to take a quick break while it wasn't busy. I leaned my head on the back of the seat and closed my eyes to rest them. I was being sure not to fall asleep, but soon a knock came at the door. My eyes shot open as I was startled by the sudden noise. An older man was standing at the door looking at me. I made a nervous and awkward smile, then opened the door. He stepped in and scanned his bus pass, then went to the very back of the bus and sat down. Nobody else is out, so I can drop you off wherever you need," I yelled, turning my head slightly towards the back. There was a really awkward few seconds before I turned back forward and started on the road again. I thought he might have had earbuds in or something, so I was just going to do it the hard way and stop at every bus stop along the route like I was supposed to. Over the course of the drive, I constantly checked the mirror, seeing the man just sitting in the back staring ahead. It was odd behavior, but who knows what these people have on their minds at 3 a.m. I pulled up to every stop on the route and was approaching the last 2, wondering when this man was going to get off. After these, it just loops back around to where I picked him up. When I stopped at the next spot, I put the bus in park and looked at the man in the mirror. After a second, he got up. He began walking down the aisle, but the way he was staring at the floor was really unusual. As he got closer, I turned my body around and could see his face. It was full of anger and rage. I tried to act normal, turning my face to the road again, but the guy stopped right next to me. I looked over and he was staring down at me. "Is everything okay?" The man continued staring, but then he looked away and walked back down the aisle and sat down. This was the point where I knew something was very wrong and I started to worry. After a moment, I put the bus back in drive and headed to the next and final stop. When we arrived, I put it in park and waited. There was a sort of tension in this moment that was hard to describe. I looked ahead at the empty roads and sidewalks. Then the man got up and walked quickly down the aisle. He approached me, but this time, he shoved me against the side window and held a gun against my head. Looking him in the eyes, he had that same look as before. Crazed anger and rage. I didn't know why or what he wanted from me, but I was sure he was going to pull that trigger. The man didn't say anything. He just tensed up and pushed the gun against my head even harder, still staring me in the eyes. Then, he opened his mouth wide and screamed right in my face. Just a painfully loud, angry scream. Then he let go, backed up, and walked out. I closed the door quickly and drove away. I called the police as soon as possible, knowing that his bus pass would have his identity in the system. An officer was sent to where I dropped the man off, while one came to where I was to get more information. A couple days later, they showed me a picture of the man who was on the bus pass that the stranger had used, but it was a completely different person. I don't know what kind of sick mind that man had, or what he wanted from me, but that was the most unusual, disturbing, and creepy encounter I've ever had, and will probably ever have. I worked at a library in my mid-20s up until my early 30s. I worked overnight shifts there as a stocker and reorganizer. When I applied, I was told I'd be working mid-shifts, but a few months later they decided to open a new overnight position. This place was huge and was an old stone building in the center of town, repurposed into a library. Being so large though, stocking and reorganizing the books became too much for us employees to do consistently throughout the day. Nobody wanted to do the night shift though, mainly because they only opened a single position, meaning whoever it was would be alone all night. I really didn't want to do it either, but they offered to increase pay by $2 per hour for overnight shifts. That was a big deal for me at the time, so I took it. A few months in, everything was going well. Even though I was technically doing the same job as I was when I worked mid-shifts, it was a completely different job. I didn't have to interact with customers, waste time helping them, or anything. I just did my work, listened to music, and nobody bothered me. Over the following months though, I strangely started to become less and less comfortable while working. It was weird because I figured I should be getting more comfortable as time went on. But I began thinking about how old the building was, and it kind of creeped me out. Sometimes I'd look up from the bookshelf and see the empty, dark room with what felt like hundreds of aisles where anything could be hiding. I'd pull my headphones out and listen, hearing nothing but silence, which for some reason made me feel even more creeped out. But then one night when I was doing my usual, listening to music and stocking, I heard something from the other side of the large room. I stopped moving for a moment as it registered in my head that I did actually hear something. Then I pulled out my headphones and looked up. I kind of just stood there for a few minutes, scared to move. I was waiting for something else to happen, but nothing ever did, so I went back to my work. This time I left my headphones out though. I finished rearranging the shelf, then I rolled my cart to the back to grab all the book returns. But that's when I heard it again. This time with my headphones away, I could confirm it was inside the building, and I could tell it was the sound of something falling on the ground. It might have sounded just like a small book hitting the floor, but in such a large, quiet room, it echoed loudly. Again, I froze and just stared in the direction I heard the sound coming from. Considering the building was full of books, it didn't seem unlikely for a couple books to fall down randomly, but that didn't really make me feel any more comfort. Something felt off, like I was being watched. My head started doing that thing again, going through every reason to be scared of the place, and I was trying really hard not to panic. I knew the likelihood of it just being a book falling off the shelf was high, and I also knew that I'd often get into my head and scare myself for no reason, so I got myself to walk over and check. I walked slowly through the aisles of bookshelves, looking down each one. I got to the very last aisle. There was nothing, not a book or anything down any of the aisles. The panic started to come up in my head again. I turned around and my heart stopped. Someone was standing by the door leading to the back storage room. They were in the far corner, as if trying to hide against the wall, but I could tell they were watching me. I resisted every urge in my body to scream and run. I looked away, walked back down the aisles, unlocked the front door, and walked out. As soon as the door closed behind me, I sprinted around the back of the building to my car and locked myself inside, then called the police. I was shaking and crying. When they arrived, I came to the front of the building and waited while two of them searched inside, but they came out alone. Apparently they didn't find anyone. My mind immediately thought of how I should have locked the front door after I got out, but I was so afraid I didn't even think about it. My manager had us do a stock count and everything in the following days, but nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. No large amounts of stock missing. It made everyone question why the person was in the building, or if there even was a person at all. It really sucks because a lot of my coworkers thought that it was just some weird trick to get me out of working night shifts. I know what I heard though. There was no mistake, and I know what I saw too. Despite that horrifying night, I still kept my job. They were nice enough to let me do mid-shifts for a month before going back to nights. After that though, nothing else ever happened. I'm just left with the mystery of what that man was trying to do.
I spend a lot of my spare nights doing deliveries for DoorDash. It's my way of getting extra money while also not needing to commit to a more strict second job. I started driving around 9 p.m. on this night and steadily took on some orders until 11, where it slowed down a bit. During this time, I just drove around the shopping center that had most of the fast food restaurants people often ordered from, and eventually another order came through. It was a regular order to be delivered about 4 miles away. After getting the food, I started the directions to the address, and it was almost immediately apparent that it wasn't a house. I scrolled in on the map, which only showed streets and buildings, and the address it pointed to was along a street that had no buildings on it. It looked kind of like an empty plot of land, but the DoorDash map was never that great, so I just started driving and decided to at least check it out and maybe call the customer if there was an issue. I drove out, taking just under 20 minutes until I reached the street it was on. This street was very bare, no houses or crossroads, and no cars driving on it. When I got to the end, it became a gravel road, and on the side was a small wooden sign that was too weathered to be legible. I pulled onto the gravel and turned my brights on, and right away I could see something far off down the road. I drove in closer, and as I approached it, my phone dinged to let me know that I'd arrived. In my headlights was a small mobile home, or some kind of RV, and on the door were poorly painted numbers. I looked back at my phone. 2760. It was the address. I got out, holding the food in my hand as I walked up to the RV. Getting closer, it was a bit unsettling to look at. It was overgrown and old, which was strange considering it was a mobile home meant to be moving around. I gave it a knock and waited. This was a rare cash order, which made more sense once I saw the place, but it definitely didn't make me feel good having to stand here. As I looked around, an eerie feeling loomed over me. This place was surrounded by the woods with no lights anywhere. Past the RV, it was complete darkness. I heard something from inside, and I prepared for them to open the door, but then a voice to my right startled me. I looked over and saw a man smiling at me, standing by the corner of the RV. He asked if I had his order, and I nodded, apologizing and walking it over to him. I handed it off and said his total. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill, then smiled again and said he just needed to grab the rest. He turned and walked back around the RV while I stayed where I was. This whole interaction in writing doesn't seem as off as it was in person, but I can tell you there was something very wrong about this guy. It was just something about the way he acted and said everything that gave me chills. I waited for a minute or so before getting more nervous and looking around the corner to see where he went. In the distance, I saw a figure standing by what looked like the dark outline of a shed. They were not walking, they were just standing there. As the fear grew inside me, my head jolted around, hearing the door to the RV opening. A different man looked out at me, and just as I started to greet him, he slammed the door shut. My heartbeat now intensifying, I looked back out at the man who was by the shed. He was now walking back toward the RV, but had something else in his hands. In the moment, I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was either a long bat or a rifle. I ran back to the car, getting in and turning it on with shaky hands as I put it in reverse. The man came around the side of the mobile home and stood calmly in the darkness as I drove off. I don't know what happened there, but I wasn't exactly keen on finding out. I went straight home afterwards and debated calling 911, but was caught up on the fact that I didn't actually know what was going on. In the end, I made the regretful decision not to notify the police. Whatever happened that night will remain as just the strange encounter it was, with no answers to the true nature of it. Before I get into this next story, I want to talk about an important sponsor for today's video. Aura is an advanced online digital security service, allowing you to scan and remove your personal data from various online sources, including scam centers, the dark web, and data brokers. These entities profit from your private information, making it crucial to eliminate your data from their reach. And Aura makes it as simple as possible for us to do this. With their free trial, I was registered in minutes and had Aura scan and remove my data with just a few clicks. They notified me about dozens of places all across the internet where they found my personal data, like my full name, phone number, and address. And without Aura, I never would have known. Afterwards, Aura continuously monitors my data, instantly notifying me of any issues that arise and enabling swift resolution. They also include a feature to encrypt your home's Wi-Fi, ensuring the security of all your connected devices. In today's world, personal identity and data theft are unfortunately widespread, affecting a significant number of US citizens, with millions falling victim each year, resulting in huge financial losses. With Aura, you can have the utmost confidence in your security and prevention measures. For a completely free 14-day trial, visit aura.com/whispered or scan the provided QR code. During this trial, you can discover if your personal data has been compromised, remove your data from multiple prominent platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I highly recommend using this free trial to see if your data has been stolen and to keep your identity secure. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video and keeping our personal data secure. I work at a 24-hour drive-thru restaurant, and this had happened only a few weeks ago. I'm a crew manager, but for the most part, I just do the same things everyone else does, which is cook and take orders. For overnight hours, we always have at least 2 people, one being a manager and the other usually being a cook. On this night, the cook had called in sick, and when I called the others to see if they could cover his shift, none of them said they could. So by 12 a.m., I was the only worker there. Now usually the restaurant doesn't get busy overnight, and more employees come in at 4 a.m., so it wasn't an entire shift alone, but it still meant that for 4 hours I had to do everything myself. I left my headset on in case someone came to the drive-thru, then started working on the tasks I had for the night. I started by scraping and cleaning the stovetops, but a few minutes in, I was interrupted by a banging sound from the front of the restaurant. I walked down and looked over the counter, seeing a man standing at the front door and banging on it. Then he pressed his face against the glass and looked inside, scanning the whole room before his eyes set on me. I walked over to the door as he stared at me, and when I got closer, he backed up and waited like he thought I was going to open it. I yelled through the glass that our dine-in area was closed and that he needed to use the drive-thru if he wanted to order something. He looked confused, so I yelled again that the doors were locked and he had to use the drive-thru. He showed no response that time, not giving me any idea whether he understood me or not, so I just turned around and walked back to the kitchen. I figured he'd have to get the hint at some point that the doors weren't opening. I continued working on the stovetops, spending at least 15 to 20 minutes on them. Throughout this time, I had gone once to check the front to see if the man had left, and from what I could see, he was gone. The whole parking lot was empty, and the man was not at the door. But it was a couple minutes after finishing with the stoves that I got an alert from my headset that someone was in the drive-thru. I turned on my mic and asked for their order while walking to the window, but nobody said anything. When I got to the window, I immediately saw in the camera that there wasn't a car out there. I looked around the screen and didn't see any movement either, so I ignored it and started walking back. But as I got to the back room, I slowed to a stop when I thought I heard something. I stood in place and listened as footsteps slowly walked above me on the roof of the building. They were careful steps, not making much sound aside from the roof creaking, but I had no doubt that there was someone up there. I followed the sound of their steps with my stare, moving down the ceiling until I saw the ladder leading to the maintenance hatch, and that's when I realized what they were doing. I sprinted over to the ladder and started looking for some sort of lock to keep the hatch from opening, but I'd never even used it, so I had no clue how it worked or if it even locked. Then there was a loud creak from the ceiling directly above me, and a few thuds came from the outside of the hatch. A moment passed, then the hatch creaked open slightly, and through the small gap, all I saw were a set of eyes staring back at me. I sprinted for the front of the building, hearing loud thuds from where the hatch was as I quickly unlocked the door and ran for my car. I called the police as I sat inside and frantically looked through the windows of the restaurant. While on the phone, I saw a shadow moving by the front counter. Then a man appeared, standing in the far back of the restaurant, but was looking in my direction. After a moment, he turned and disappeared behind the kitchen, leaving me in a panic until the police made it. They searched inside and outside, going on the roof as well, but the man had already run off. Nothing from the place was missing either. No equipment or money was taken. Nothing. He just broke in and left. I tried to not think about it too much, but it's hard not to come to the conclusion that he was there for me. Like I said, this happened pretty recently, so there's still not much of an update on it. Even with his face on the cameras, there's yet to be a confirmed identity. The owner of the building added a padlock to the inside of the hatch though, which should have been done before, but I guess it was just an inconvenience. I still worry about the man's intentions, and if he could be watching for me to be alone again, waiting to do whatever it was he tried before. Over the last 5 years, I've been working at different odd jobs all around the country. I live in a van, so I move around a lot, but a few months out of the year, I have to stay in an area for an extended amount of time in order to rack up some cash before moving on. At this time, I was staying in the mid-east portion of Utah, and I'd taken up a job at a gas station. It was located on a road that was really only used by locals to go in and out of state without having to deal with the highway traffic. There was nothing else on this route. It was simply a road with a lone gas station for the occasional driver to fill up at. That's kind of why it was perfect for me though, because the location of it didn't matter. Since I lived in a van, I could easily stay out there for an extended amount of time and work. Anyway, I'd been there for a bit over a month, and up to this point, I was still working random shifts. This day I was working 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was really not a special night by any means. No customers aside from a few stopping by the pumps, and not much to do as far as stocking or anything. I was mostly standing around on my phone, or pacing around the store and making the shelves look nice. Then at 1 a.m., a customer pulled into the station, parking in one of the few spaces right in front of the door. Knowing they must be coming inside, I went back to the counter. A man got out and came into the shop, looking over and smiling at me, then giving me a nod as he turned down one of the aisles. He started whistling as he looked at a couple things, picking them up and putting them back, then continuing down the aisle and repeating this. I wasn't sure if he was just taking a break from driving, or if he actually needed something, but the items he was picking up and looking at were all different, and he didn't actually seem interested in buying them. Then he abruptly stopped whistling, walked over to the door, and left. I didn't think he stole anything, but it was strange. He got into his car and started moving around, reaching into his back seat before getting back out of his car and coming into the shop again. After seeing that, I wasn't feeling too comfortable. This seemed almost exactly how I thought an armed robbery would begin like, but the aggression I was expecting when he came back in didn't happen. He walked over to the counter and asked how my night was, starting a quick back and forth of small talk. I acted as normal as I could, just in case I was overthinking everything. But then he asked if I could help him with his car. He said his tires needed air and that he didn't see any pumps outside. This station didn't have any air pumps for self-use, but we did carry a handheld air compressor for emergency situations. I got it out and followed him to his car. He pointed down at the tire that needed it, and I ducked down, putting the compressor line in. I had it in for less than 10 seconds before it read the pressure to be at the right level. I looked over at the man, seeing him looking down at me with no expression. I took everything out and stood up, starting to walk back to the shop when he stopped me by rushing in front of the door. His right hand was deep inside his jacket pocket as he stared at me with a cold face. I told him to move, but of course he stayed in front of the door, though I could see it in his eyes that he was preparing to do something. I took a step back, trying to say what I could to calm the intensity of the situation, but just as I thought he was going to snap, he suddenly ran around me and got in his car, pulling out aggressively and speeding away. I took this time to go inside and call 911, and surprisingly, they arrived out here only minutes later. They were already on the chase, looking for the exact car the man was driving. The officers stated the man was on the run from a recently committed crime near the border. They didn't give me any details, but the way they said it made me think it wasn't just some small robbery. After my quick statement, they got on the road again, and after that, I never got an update. I tried to look up recent crimes and everything, but could not find anything useful. I don't know what he was planning to do, or why he actually stopped at the station, but my best guess could have been to steal my van and conceal his tracks, or at least delay them. However, depending on what crime he had just committed, I think my life could have easily been at risk, and why he chose not to do anything to me is unknown.